Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last session of this webinar series about rhythm and research on bodily practices. Today, we're very pleased to receive Gregor Dobler. He has done amazing work in the study of rhythm. And the format that we are going to follow today is a bit different from the previous sessions. So Gregor prefers to have an open conversation. We have prepared some questions, but he also asked for everyone who has a question to just pop it up and submit the question directly. So it's going to be a more dynamic session, and we'll have 1 hour speaking with him. And after that, I'm going to be presenting something about how anthropologists have approached the idea of rhythm. So remember that we are recording these sessions. So if you prefer, you can turn off your camera and you won't be recorded. So thank you very much, Gregor, for coming here. For those of you who doesn't know him, he's a professor at the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the Albert Ludwigs Universität Freiburg. Part of his research has centered on working rhythms and in the micro-ethnographic descriptions of it. He has made significant contributions to the study of rhythm, showing how rhythm can be observed, analyzed, and what do they do to people when involved in a rhythmical settings. Today, we are going to be probably talking about a work that he published in 2016. It's about work rhythms. So welcome, Gregor. Thank you very much for joining us and for accepting to participate here.
Thank you very much, everybody, for showing up, being here. I'm not sure if I can fulfill the expectations that Francisco raised now. I feel that all of you know much more about rhythm than I do. But I hope that we can come into a conversation. That's why I also prefer that format, that we can really engage with each other and combine our experiences and our approaches to rhythm. Yes, so that's why I prefer the format of a conversation. And whenever anybody of you wants to join in, wants to ask, wants to comment, to criticize, please feel free to do so. So that's not a monopoly, but really becomes a conversation.
Thank you, Gregor. So, Gregor, to begin with this conversation, could you please introduce your work on the rhythm of working, please?
Yes, well, I came to rhythm by a rather unusual pathway. I'm, among other things, an anthropologist of work and labor. So I'm interested in what people are doing when they are working, how they experience work in their daily lives. And I think that work always is caught between alienation on the one hand and fulfillment on the other. It's simultaneously done for the sake of its product, for its outcome. It has to be effective, it has to produce something. But at the same time, it's also an activity that can be done for the sake of its own, that can have its own logic, its own fulfillment, and that is part of how we as human beings engage with the world. And these two sides of work are, I think, always present in how we are working. One of the sides can become more prominent or more prevalent than the other. But as long as human beings remain human beings and the work in some degree remains their own, both sides are present in working experiences. So my basic question was how that experience of work as fulfilling or alienating is generated, what its conditions are, and how the relation between those two kinds of experience relates to the way people can structure their work. And at that point, I came across, or I rethought of somebody I came across a long time ago, the work of Karl Buker, who's a German economist nobody knows. He died about 100 years ago and is largely forgotten, but he's still in anthropology. He has a history of effectiveness, let's say. People used his thoughts, especially some classics of anthropology, from Malinowski to Raymond Firth to Hertz in France. They engaged with his work. And Karl Bucher, in one of his works, was interested in how work and rhythm relate to each other. And while I don't think his answers are particularly useful to describe many kinds of work, I think the question is very useful. And I tried to use that question to look at experiences of work. And the example I took was peasant work in northern Namibia. But what I was interested in when I described how peasants worked in a very ethnographic, very micro manner, was rather an anthropological theme in the broad sense. So how we as human beings use different kinds of rhythmization in working. So that's what made me look at rhythm. So I'm not a specialist for rhythms. I'm not a specialist for music, for bodily movements. I'm rather coming from the side of human agency in work.
And when you talk about this idea of micro ethnography, what do you mean by that?
Well, I basically mean that you pay attention to what people are actually doing when they are working. That you really take into account their movements, their bodily ways of engaging the world, their mental ways of engaging the world as well, obviously. That you see that you don't take an outlook on work for granted, but that your ethnography is informed by carefully observing what people are doing, by sharing their work and making experiences in your own body, and by then speaking about those experiences and their experiences with the people involved. And that sounds like it was self-evident for anthropologists to do that. But if you look at anthropological descriptions of work and also of rhythms, very often the real engagement with what people are doing is rather shallow. People put ideas into what they see in the actions of people, rather than taking the actions themselves and generating ideas from that careful observation and participation. So that's, on the one hand, it seems self-evident. On the other hand, it is astonishingly absent from large parts of anthropology which is interested in theory at all.
Remember in your paper about work rhythms among Namibian pearling palm millets, when you comment on this exactly the same observation that you are sharing us today, the idea of sometimes is granted or is something that is apparently evident, but when it comes to talk about rhythm, you noted and you criticize when we work with the idea or with the term without being specific of what are we really looking at, what are the particular gestures of movement or things that are affecting or not the rhythmicity of work. And so in that regard, of course, I completely agree with your point of view. But I was also thinking in the multi-scalar level of rhythmicity. So the seasonal variations up to the gestures of hammering. Okay, so it's a broad spectrum where we can appreciate rhythm. So regarding the microethnographic descriptions, is there any point that you will suggest how we can define that micro level when that micro level turns to macro or to intermediate level, or is there more micro levels or layers that we could be adding to in our observations?
That's a point I've been struggling with, and in which I really liked to have the comments of those who might have read the paper, because I'm not sure the way I use rhythm in the paper actually makes sense. What I do is I use different kinds of regularity and call all of these kinds different rhythms. That starts with regularity of bodily movements while working. For example, pounding millet. That's a basic rhythm that is musical, that is repetitive, that has the same relation to the underlying beat for every movement. And that can be described as a rhythm in the musical sense, really. Then you have what I call rhythm of strain and rest. You keep that continuous rhythm for a specific time, and then you have to rest because you can't keep it up the whole day. Then you have alternation of tasks. You pound, and then you add new millet to your mortar. These are just examples of things I describe as rhythms because all of them have to do with the organization of work over time. And all of them meet in the point that if we can organize those things according to our own guise, in our own way, we feel more autonomous in our work than we would do if that rhythm was imposed on us from outside actors. So they meet in a sense of freedom, which makes the action we do while working our own action. In that sense, I think it does make sense to combine them under the term of rhythm. But I'm not sure if they actually describe the same thing. If the rhythm of pounding is the same as the rhythm of strain and rest. If it makes sense to use the same word for them. I did because I found it heuristically a good way of writing the paper, but I'm not sure if it really makes sense theoretically.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the resting periods, relaxation, which are of course part of any practical activity. Mm-hmm. But it's also something that today we see that is super or hyper regulated. I am talking now about most Western contemporary society, how political systems and economies have also regulated the way we rest, when we rest, mm-hmm. the days that we are supposed to rest. And I'm speaking about this because during my fieldwork, for instance, when we were preparing mud bricks, and I remember that a very important part of the process is called halpa. And in Quechua, this is a Quechua word, halpa. One could say that it is a rest, if we look at it from our own perspective. Mm-hmm. But then we come with this contradiction that rest implies non-production. The rest is if you look at it from a very contemporary point of view, when we rest, we are not producing, and therefore when my friends in the Andes were working for people from other places, for instance, from Peru's capital, from Lima, people from Lima used to say that these people are lazy and that they rest while they're working and so on. However, for them, Jalpa was very productive and was a moment that, although they rest physically, they can recover energy. It's also the moment when other agents, non-human agents, in this case it was the sun and the wind, work and take their own part in the production of mud bricks. So it's the moment, Jalpa is also the moment where the sun dries the mud bricks, the wind dries the mud brick, or the rain cut affected. So yes, I'm wondering, like, what's your opinion on how rhythms might be and maybe a tool, either methodological or theoretical, to start conceptualizing different ways of working processes and particularly with this idea of resting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish we all had that concept of Jalpa in our own work. As you said, it's always a fight between different ways of organizing the work. And the Marxian concept of alienation really starts at that point where you see work, you no longer have the ability to control how you are working, and you no longer have the capability to control the product of your work. So you cannot decide when to take a break, how long the break is, but the break becomes nothing more than a factor in the reproduction of labor. And various occupations, for example, scholars, have strategies to immunize their periods of rest and of doing nothing against that logic. They say, I need time to think, for example. I'm not lazy. This is a period where new thoughts emerge. But very few occupations today can actually take such, can organize their work in a way that this is deemed legitimate by those people who are paying them. But if you look at how people are working when they have the freedom to organize their own work, these periods of rest become essential for work over the long time, for how it is conducted, for how they can keep up the strain and the dreariness of continuous labor. It's important for them to be able to structure work and breaks. In that sense, breaks are always productive, but it's even more productive to take them in your own rhythm, either as a collective or as an individual.
Yeah. I think that Beatriz Herrera and Richard, they both have some questions. So let's start with Beatriz, just because she raised her hand, I think that before than you, Richard.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for this fascinating approach on rhythm. And it is, I like listening to you. It brings me back on how fascinating it is to come back to Marxist terms in order to talk about work and labor. And it also brought me to think on the studies on the peasant labor and how it has been, this labor has been always understood in the terms on productivity and Western concept productivity, but it has never been thought in a way of cultural production, for example. So there's like, I don't know if, at least in the case of Guatemala, I couldn't find a work on the focus on the labor as the cultural workers in the peasant villages. I would dream to find something like that, but it leads me to think that way, and it also leads me to think, and what I want to ask you is about the conceptions of time, because for me, and rhythm, it's also very much linked to time, organization, how we think about time and progressions, and for also in terms in artistic works, for example, or dance, music and dance traditions, which some villages in Guatemala, they had put up stage works that last for 8 hours long, and they perform 8 hours. And it is very crazy to think about how you stand the performance of 8 hours. So within different rhythms, so that's why I wanted to ask you, how much do you also relate your work to time studies?
Well, two big questions. As to peasant labor as cultural work, what interests me most is how people see their own work. And in the peasant societies I know, people see their work as producing grain or potatoes or manioc, whatever it is, in the first place. But they also see their work as producing the world at large, a relation to the world, a good environment, a relation to the spiritual forces and the land, and so on. But for the people I know, the second is a precondition for the first. So it's not their basic aim to produce a good relation to the environment, but you have to work in a way that respects the environment or the spiritual forces in the environment in order to produce the things you are eating or you are selling on the market. So that's the basic logic, is one of productivity, but that doesn't preclude that this other logic or other kinds of logics are as important for the way you organize your work. Time studies interest me very much, but I never know how really to study this anthropologically. I find it very difficult to tell what time means to people. If you look at these basic descriptions, let's say E.P. Thompson, task time versus clock time, I don't think they are useful if they are assigned to specific people. This person lives in clock time and that person lives in task time. We all live in both times at the same time and change our relation to time accordingly. And so here again, I would argue for careful ethnography that takes serious how people relate to time in their own actions. But it's a very difficult field to find out enough about. Because if you ask people, how do you experience time? I mean, try to describe this for your own. It's very difficult. So you have to find ways of engaging with that tacit, non-spoken about, and often not predicated knowledge and relation to time. We could speak about this, but that would be really a section of methodology which might not interest everybody. I'm not sure about this.
Thank you very much for your question, Beatrice. Richard, would you like to make your question?
Yeah, not sure if it's a question, but I was very interested in the idea of rest, and that rhythm needs rest for it to be established as a rhythm. So I was very interested in maybe going a little further, a little deeper in that concept of rest and how, what do you think of a rest? I mean, in given different types of work or even as a dancer or as a musician, you know, where I see it as rest being quite important or running parallel to that fact of rhythm, because at times you need that pause. Because everything, I mean, we talked about hammering, or I'm thinking about the rhythms in a chain gang, swinging that axe, that swing up is your pause to get the action to come down. And then we have that, you know, chain gang, so ha, ha. And there is an element of a rest, that a cycle that creates that rhythm. So I was wondering, you know, if we can go a little deeper in that idea of rest, which I was finding very interesting from a rhythmic point of view and a word point of view. Thank you.
That's a very interesting point. I would like to discuss with dancers and musicians more, because perhaps the first intuition would be that if you're playing music in an orchestra, the period when you have a pause where you're not playing your instrument is rest. I think that would be completely wrong. It isn't rest. There's a tension there. There's an anticipation there. You have to be present, very much so, and perhaps even more so than while you're actually playing. So just as hammering itself can become an occasion to let your mind wander, and in that sense be restful, waiting for the moment to pound might actually be much more engaging. And so I just would love to know more about this. How does it feel for musicians, for dancers, how do they structure their attention to what they are doing over the course of an evening or over the course of 8 hours of a play? I can't remember whose work this is. There was a performance where people feign that they are resting on stage. And the artists who were in that performance told me that it's so stressful. You cannot just lay down in front of an audience, but you have to consciously give the impression of resting. So yes, that's something I would love to know more about.
Thank you very much, Richard and Gregor, for your answer. I know that in this group we have a group bunch of people that do dance. So maybe someone of you would like to share their experiences about what we are talking. It would be amazing. Probably it will inform us very much of what we are talking now. So I remember that in your paper, going back to your paper, I'm sorry, we're going to be to move a bit away from the idea of repose or pauses. But you mentioned that one of the key authors that you bring, or that at least inspired your work, was this German economist Karl Buker. I know that Karl Buker and other scholars as well were fascinated or were struggling really with this industrialization and with the rhythms of industrialized work. Could you please tell us a bit more about the context or the material that Karl Buker is talking about?
Yes, so Buker he is writing in that moment where the social sciences, the emerging sociology, the national economy, economists are reflecting or are becoming conscious of the fact that modernity is now shaping their own lives. So it's the same period as Georg Simmel, as Max Weber, as Tönnies, other thinkers who try to find a social scientific description of their own life world, which they feel is changing, has changed since their youth, and affects them in ways in which they don't really know whether they like them or not. Also in their everyday relation to their own social environment. And for Karl Bucher, this also meant thinking about industrial labor. And he found that one of the basic questions of his time was how workers in industry could keep up what they were doing, even under alienated conditions, without becoming mad or stopping to work or revolt, making a revolution. So how is it possible to keep up alienated work over a longer time? And that's also how he came to the notion of rhythm. But then in his examples, he doesn't use modern society at all. He goes back to what he calls primitive society, which for him meant both ancient societies and contemporary societies, which he deemed to be primitive. And that's where he looks at rhythms. And he's also interested in that because he thinks that music and poetry actually start from work songs and start from rhythmic work experiences. So his work, if you take it literally, is actually not very interesting to analyze industrial labor. But after him, some sociologists actually looked at industrial labor using his categories. And this was most pronounced in that struggle between the Fordist and Taylorist conception of industrial labor. In Taylorism, you break down the bodily movements of workers to the millisecond to structure what people are doing to become more efficient. In Fordism, you break down the entire working process into units, but those units can be freely acted out or can be freely done by individual workers. So they have a measure of freedom to find their own rhythm. And in that fight, sociologists who were on the Fordist side, they took Bucher and said, we find this in industrial labor. So one German sociologist did fieldwork in a Ford factory and actually described how people could make alienated industrial work their own by finding their own micro-rhythm in work. I'm both convinced and skeptical, because I think it's very important not to take the preconceived notion that industrial work is alienated and that stand in the way of looking at what people are actually doing and looking at what freedom remains to them. So in that sense, I'm convinced you should take that perspective. You should look at how people are actually experiencing their work. And I think human beings have a tendency of trying to structure and to find freedom in things they are condemned to do. On the other hand, I think that perspective does not take into account one very important rhythm or structure of what people are doing, which is the rhythm between having accomplished something and doing something, having finished with a task and being glad about having finished this, having written this paper, having produced this amount of millet and being able to harvest it and feast. If your work in a factory is putting screws into a machine, you never have that moment of having finished a task. It's always present, it's always there. So in that sense, there's an important rhythm which defines work, which is lacking here. And it's lacking whether you have what David Graeber called bullshit jobs or where you have real jobs. It's just part of the way the work is organized. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's fantastic. Fascinated the contrast that you explained us between Fordism and Taylorism. I wasn't aware of that, and yeah, it's probably it's a huge debate that I will have to also look in depth. Anyone, please feel free to make your questions or comments. Gregor asked us for that modality, so he's expecting a much more dynamic conversation with us. And I was thinking, oh, here we have a question again from Beatrice.
Oh.
Do you have access to the chat, Gregor?
Yes.
Okay.
Very simple, straightforward question. How do I understand freedom? I understand freedom not in any philosophical fundamental sense. I understand it here as the feeling you get, the experience you make of being able to act as you wish. And human beings are never completely free to act as they wish. They're always under structural conditions, they're always under restraint, they always act under their own aims, which might preclude doing what I want to do right now because I want to achieve something later on. But in that complete framework, the attention that you direct towards your own action can make you feel that you are restricted, or it can make you feel that you are free in that moment. And that's the freedom I'm speaking about. So it's a very limited notion of freedom. It can exist under the most alienated conditions. It can just mean that you forget how heteronomous your work actually is. But still in your experience, it creates a space of autonomy. That is very important for the way you keep up what you're doing. And it feels as if it was you deciding, even if it isn't.
Thank you very much, Beatrice and Gregor, for your answer. I think that Jorge has a question as well.
Yes, thank you. So I was trying to also compare or to grasp a little bit of on this approach to follow the rhythm or to study the rhythm in work or for work. And I thought of what could be a key element or some insights to start doing the same task for these times, because a lot of the working experiences have been reduced to working on a computer, on a desk. And I know that that is a repetitive experience across the globe for a lot of people that belong to different industries and different businesses. So I was wondering if we could somehow, you could suggest an element or or an insight to start tracing these rhythmic patterns or approach it from a rhythmic perspective, the work that we're doing nowadays.
Mm-hmm. I haven't really studied this, but I've spoken to a lot of people, and I'm doing work on a computer myself, as all of you are probably. And I think for many people who do so, it has become an essential question today how to structure their workday. At what point do you answer emails? How often do you look at your emails? How often do you let yourself be distracted by emails? On a more macro level, some companies forbid their employees to look at their emails after knock-off time, because that is for rest and for reduction of your labor time. Others ask them to engage with emails on a Sunday or at 11:30 at night. And that is a societal topic. I think that also comes down to rhythm. How free are you to choose in what time structure you are working? And I think that today the tendency is more and more to separate professions in which you can work autonomously. You can decide by yourself which structure of the workday you create for yourself, and those others in which that is decided for yourselves by other people. Which does not mean the one is less alienated or more alienated than the other, but it certainly feels like that very often. And I think all working people today, especially if working in an office or remotely, or if the work is affected by email and other means of communication, are trying to save spaces of autonomy for themselves. And sometimes succeeding, and sometimes not. This is also linked to more general discussions about time politics. So some unions, for example, say, we stop asking for shorter working hours. We're asking for more breaks in between, which people can freely choose, which is a different concept. So we want to structure the working day differently and no longer make it shorter. So these questions are with us. They are present in everyday life. And I think we should pay much more attention to them, also ethnographically, which I have not done yet.
Thank you very much, Gregor. We have a question from Sandro on the chat box, which is, could you elaborate a bit more on pause versus rest and the role of release and anticipation, which I understand to be fundamental for a pro-generative rhythmicity?
Well, Sandro, I understand that as a comment rather. You want me to say something you want to say. So perhaps you could just say it. And I'm sure I agree.
So Sandro, please, if you are hearing.
Yeah, hi Gregor. Nice to see you. Yeah, I was wondering, you were saying, we're giving this example of not playing the note, and giving the example of the tension we might feel before we do something, for example, before the action. So in the pause or still in the pause. But I was wondering, what about these moments of waiting, of resting? Do you think, what does anticipation, is there anticipation in it? And maybe does it also relate to different feelings of time, of if it's a more clock time feeling, more another sense of time, more linear, more cyclical sense of time. So do you feel that there is anticipation in rest, or can it be absent in a way?
I think there are all variants at play here. So the basic question which you also posed in the chat to me is, how are actions brought forward? So how is our relation to time in acting? How do we link present and future through actions? And rhythm, on the one hand, is a way of, so if the rhythm of pounding, of hammering, that is, you bring action forward without seeming to. It feels like the same all over again, so it feels like stasis, but at the same time, you continue actions over time. So that's one way of bringing things forward into the future. A second way is anticipation, which can be linked to waiting, but doesn't have to, I would say. So because waiting is very passive, you can anticipate in a more active sense, but that's a different discussion. So you can anticipate a moment that is going to arrive, or which you hope is going to arrive, and bridge present and future in this sense. But during breaks, during rest, you might also decouple present and future and just concentrate on the present, not anticipating that you have to work again on a Monday morning, but simply being that you don't have to work now. And then you often need devices to which you delegate the task of bringing you back to work. The alarm clock in the morning, clocks in general, emails by somebody who reminds you of a deadline, and so on. So in that sense, you consciously or unconsciously decouple the moment you're living now from the time that is passing and the knowledge that you have to stop, right? That you have to start again at some point. So these are very different relations between not doing anything at the moment and having to do something in the future.
Thank you very much, Sandro and Gregor. Sandro, please, I interrupted. I think you want to add something more?
No, just thank you. Thank you, Gregor.
Thanks, Sandro.
Yeah, very interesting question and point of view as well. Nayara, she has a question. So Nayara, please go ahead.
Yes, actually I have a comment to say that this whole conversation is very interesting in bringing this political aspect to the discussions about rhythm and time and how it regulates a lot how the society works nowadays, because it regulates the way we actually work and how it can also affect the way that we artists produce art. And being a dancer, I could say that, for example, in my dance style is very common the critics to dancers that are dancing too fast, and which people are saying like, people now they are dancing too fast and you cannot enjoy actually the dance because the dancer is trying to read each part of the music and it gets like a mess. And it's interesting how I think it's also a relation with this idea of condemnation of the rest time and how it's the non-productive rest time is seen as a bad thing, as you're not accomplishing what you should be accomplishing. And I would like to know if you have anything to say about this relationship between the politics of time in regarding work and regarding art.
I think one of the strengths of art in the way it's discursively framed in our society is that it can actually define whatever it likes to define as important for its own sake. So if you need rest, if you need concentration, if you need quickness, that can always be defined as a precondition for the success of what you're doing. So intrinsically, I think art is in a very privileged position here. But that no longer applies if you look at working conditions of artists. So there's an inherent contradiction here. Society is very clear about that artists need inspiration and rest and have to be serious, and in order to be serious they need to recenter, they need to focus on themselves and so on. That's all very much accepted, but nobody pays them for doing that, which then again creates just as for scientists, by the way, an inherent contradiction. You are tasked with finding inspiration and finding your space of inspiration while traveling across the world and doing one gig after the other. And that is yours to negotiate. So in that sense, I think we should all be actively promoting that inner logic to all kinds of creative work, or all kinds of work as such, which means if you are supposed to do it right, you have to have the conditions of doing it right, and not constantly being forced to be as creative as you can, as quickly as you can. So does that engage your question, or did you have something else in mind?
Well, it's pretty much that. That's very interesting, because I feel that too, like as being inserted in this idea of productivity in academia and in an artistic level. It's very it has to do a lot with that, how the time was being managed in a society level very politically, and most of the time we don't notice that our time is imposed, is not as the Thompson said, it is not the task time anymore, it's the clock time. And thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you very much, Nayara, for your question, and thank you, Gregor. I have another question, and if somebody else would like to raise a question, please do it, because
Pierre has something to offer.
We are running out of time, paradigmatically. So I'm thinking on this more like your opinion on, because we know the entanglement of rhythm with a broader and wider phenomena that happens in society. So we can see rhythms in work, in education, in academia, in the production of knowledge, in how we teach, and so on. So it's really like cross-cutting so many areas of human behavior. I just want to know your opinion on would it be very dangerous, or do you think that it is possible to do something like or a kind of applied rhythmical studies focused on improving these aspects that we are talking now?
Well, it depends very much on what you mean by improving.
Yeah.
I mean, there has been that science since the early 20th century trying to improve productivity of somebody else by imposing rules on them. That's not what I would anticipate as a meaningful contribution to human happiness. But if you mean by that studying how we as a society can create spaces of freedom that keep up productivity without destroying human beings, then I'm very much in favor of it. But Claire had a comment from a dance perspective. That's good. You're still, we can't hear you, sorry.
Is it better now? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Excuse me. Thank you for sharing your thought. And yes, I've been studying contemporary dance mainly from an anthropological perspective, contact improvisation and African dances for the past years. And I'm dancing myself as well. And what I've realized, it's really difficult to generalize the different senses of rhythm depending on the dance, is changing from one dance practice to the other one. In African dance, maybe from an outside perspective, you would have the feeling that it's really fast, and that is only the moment or the performance that people would give everything that they have on the same rhythm, although there are some different level and dimension. In contemporary dance, the rhythm would change much more between a slow and a fast rhythm. But I would say that rhythm is always collective, except maybe if you would be on your own, dancing on your own. But otherwise, as dance is usually a collective gathering, the rhythm is always, the subjective rhythm of one dancer would always meet the other rhythm, and it's how the different people can create a collective rhythm and find the more or less the same pace.
I would perhaps, if you generalize, I would perhaps use the word social rather than collective, because rhythm, even if you're dancing alone, is social in the sense that it engages music. It engages both a human and natural environment. The floor you're dancing on has consequences for how you dance and so on. But it doesn't need to be collective in my sense. It very often is. And whenever humans are engaging with each other, their rhythm changes. In that sense, it's also collective. But rhythms can be individual. And whenever, or the more general term then is, to me, is they are social. They can go against the other. They can try to improve on the other's rhythm and so on. And then it's very difficult to speak of collective, even in contact improvisation.
I would make a difference between a social and a collective rhythm, because an individual rhythm for me would be social as well, because it depends on the community. But then what I understand with collective rhythm, it is the moment where there is an adaptation where the different bodies try to find the same pace and dance together in the same breath, in that sense.
Yes, but if you look at contact improvisation, there are phases, I think.
There
are phases, there are different moments over the course of one improvisation. Some are collective, and some are still social, but perhaps not collective in the sense that you are really doing something jointly at the moment, but you are getting into it, you are getting out of it, engaging with a different dancer perhaps. But that's, you know more about this than I do. I'm not going to insist here. Time is running out as well.
Thank you very much, Claire, for your observations and questions. And thank you very much, Gregor, for this wonderful talk. Does anyone would like to add something more? We can still have 5 more minutes if you like. There have been very interesting topics and concepts that have appeared. So please go ahead. So, Beatrice, yeah?
So thank you, Claire, for your example of contact improvisation. It's a practice that I'm also related myself, and it's very interesting to see this distinction that you're proposing from social as being like maybe I can imagine the room where everyone is dancing, and the collective as the tiny things that are happening in between some dancers. And I have approached contact improvisation considering the intersubjective experience of touch that then sometimes leads to a shared rhythm, sometimes in duets and sometimes as even a group, when, for example, everyone is stepping at the same pace. And this kind of moments that are very spontaneous and very there is like this center of attention on what is going on. So then we follow each other and then we just make agreements in a very fast way in order to keep the dance moving on. And I wanted to ask you just for a final thought on how, when you were proposing this distinction of the social rather than collective, how do you consider the intersubjective perceptions and reactions that happen? I don't know. It's considering an activity that happens in a shared room with other people, that can be dance, can be any other activity as well.
I'm not sure, was that question to me or to Claire? You addressed Claire, but the distinction between social and individual and collective, I think, came from my side.
Sorry. The last bit of the question was for you. That was just growing up on what she had proposed.
So, Claire, do you want to react first? Answer this? Should I?
No, you can go for it.
Okay. So, for me, these are 3 different modes of relating to each other. All are social. So social means that others are co-present in your world, and you take their co-presence into account for what you're doing and how you're engaging with the world. As a second step, this can become intersubjective, which means this becomes mutual. You both take the other as a concrete other into account for your own actions and relate to your actions to the expectation that the other is going to do the same. And you develop a shared sense of being in that space. But that still is not collective in the sense I'm using the word. I think Claire is using the word differently here. Collective would be, for me, that we are subjecting our own individual beings for a specific time period to that commonness. And that for us, the group or the dyadic relation becomes the defining way of looking at our actions. So that's a very strong condition for me before I would use the word collective. But you can use it in very different manners. So that's, I think, that might be the difference in viewpoints between Claire and me here. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, Gregor and Beatrice as well, and for everyone who have participated. Thank you so much, Gregor, really, for accepting the invitation and for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. Has been amazing hearing you. And now we will have to pass to the second presentation, which is me. So thanks again. And
let me just thank everybody who was here. I would have loved to hear more of what you are doing, and I'd also love to read more of what you are writing, what you have done. So if you feel, please send me papers. I might get around to reading them at some point. And if you have any further points you would like to discuss, please feel free to address them. Google is usually quite good at finding me. So thank you very much,
you so much
for inviting me, and I'm wishing you good conversations for the remaining hour.